Kia ora, Aotearoa. Good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight to review the week is Industrial Relations spokesperson for the Labour Party, MP Darien Fenton, and Assistant Secretary at the Public Service Association, Jeff Osborne. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, it's a legislative blitzkrieg, issue 1, with inequality at a historic high. Why is the government hell-bent on crushing unions with new industrial relations legislation? Issue 2, 555 public sector jobs gone last year and another 400 to go this year. Why does the government need even more bargaining power from the new State Sector Act? And issue 3 tonight, will the Local Government Amendment Bill strangle local democracy? Plus we'll wrap with a final thought, but let's start the show with issue 1. New industrial relation laws being promoted by the government will see the removal of the requirement to conclude collective bargaining, will allow the opting out of multi-employer bargaining, and will allow partial pay reductions in the case of partial strikes. Darien's strong unions equal equitable societies. So why are we implementing more attacks on unions when inequality is at an all-time high?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think you need to look at the underlying reasons of this government. It doesn't, first of all, it doesn't like unions. That's obvious, doesn't like unions. So, you know, the language they speak is very much the language that we've seen from right-wing governments in the past and that we see from right-wing governments overseas. This is about really handing back power to employers in a very subtle way. These changes are insidious, they're not going to be obvious, but what they will do will have an enormous impact on the wages of everybody. Think for a moment about the people who are covered by collective agreements, they're union members, but the ones that also get the benefits of that. Every supermarket worker, for example, doesn't have to join the union, they get the benefits. Every large retail chain, every aged care worker, every cleaner, I could go on and on, right up to quite professional jobs. What this will do, not just the things you mentioned, but also the provision that means that the collective agreement will not have to be applied to workers in the first 30 days, will mean that employers will be able to pay less. The Minister says that they'll be able to pay more. That's ridiculous. They can do that now if they want to. So this is clearly about cutting wages, and all New Zealand workers need to be very worried about these provisions.
If these mechanisms do drive wages lower, what the hell is stopping New Zealanders just leaving for Australia, which is what we're seeing now?
That's right, and the government seems to be intent on attracting investment here on the basis of us being a low-wage economy. You've heard it before, you've heard John Key say we want to see wages drop. They were boasting about the Heinz Watty workers coming. Now what I understand about that, 350 good, well-paying jobs in Australia have moved to New Zealand. They've become 70 jobs on minimum wage, temporary workers employed by labour hire agencies.
Is there a future to that kind of economic direction?
Well, of course there's not, and that's what we've had for years. That's what we had in the 1990s, and that's when the gap opened up with Australia.
That's right.
We had good productivity, but wages didn't match. It's no wonder our kids are leaving. The whole generation of my family were in other countries.
Jeff, under these changes, the ports of Auckland could have walked away from collective bargaining without the requirements of a good faith conclusion. What is the point of collective bargaining if you don't need to bother concluding it?
Well, that's the danger of this piece of legislation, which, you know, you look at it and it seems so common sense. Oh, you know, we've tried bargaining, this bolshy dinosaur-like union has, you know, it's slowed us down too much. Look, we've tried our best, we just sort of walk away. But by that walking away, it declares that bargaining is in fact over. Now, what that takes away is the ability of those workers to then take further industrial action. So what we would have seen in the ports of Auckland, I think, and in the recent Ministry of Justice dispute PSA was involved in a couple of years ago, is the employer saying, sorry, bargaining's over, and you are all now on individual agreements. So there's no commitment there to get these deals sorted. An employer can just sit there, arms folded, happily wait, and then say, sorry, gave it a go, and walk away. And that can't be good faith, which requires you to work away at something to keep building that relationship and get a deal that, you know, may not be what each party really wants, but which is a workable compromise.
Sure.
And I think that's what we're going to lose with this pretty, as Darren said, a very insidious and subtle attack on workers' rights.
How are workers going to see that impact their daily lives? I mean, are they going to be able to see wage increases going up, or will they just not have unions there at all?
It's a perfect recipe for further wage decline.
Right.
They'll keep on going down. There's nothing in this for ordinary workers. There's the requirement or the loss of the ability to go on the collective agreement in the first 30 days, and that means you got particularly your younger workers rocking up to their first job or their new job in the context also of the 90-day probation period. And at the very moment they should be joining a union and should be getting on a collective, it's not there for them. The inability to strike is going to be lost. It's a very insidious and a very nasty piece of legislation. Is
the real attempt here a slow strangulation of the unions that are currently out there? You cut off their new members, they don't have any new blood, do they?
I think it'll actually be a fairly quick strangulation is what they're aiming for. I think it looks slow and subtle and gentle, but the reality is that once the few precious gains that unions have achieved in the past number of years get strangled away, and it stops being the in thing or the done thing for people to go on a collective agreement, and it becomes a big challenge, then I think it'll attack unions, it'll reduce union numbers, and that's bad because that will reduce wages.
Darien, is partial pay reductions for partial strikes a way of punishing workers for protesting their work conditions?
Yes, well, I asked the Minister about what the reasoning behind this was, and apparently it was to do with postal workers who reposted mail several years ago now, I think, and that was a partial strike, and there was a lot of complaining and grizzling from employers on that. I mean, this is one of the most ridiculous provisions I've ever seen. It's so bureaucratic. It will require huge amounts of work. It will require huge amounts of enforcement. They're going to have to change not only the Employment Relations Act, but also the Wages Protection Act.
Right.
And so it is quite actively to discourage workers taking action, there's no doubt about that. But I think it's also a sort of kind of punishment regime, taking away choice from workers.
And who decides how much money should be docked for partial strikes? How is that going to be worked out?
Well, exactly. Well, employers are going to have to keep record, and they're going to have to calculate what that particular part of the partial strike is worth. For example, if it's a work to rule, I have no idea how they do that, because work to rule is simply doing your job. But they're going to calculate it. It can be challenged in the Employment Relations Authority, which is already under siege, already oversubscribed, already struggling. And as I say, it's a bureaucratic nightmare, and I have no idea why they think this is important.
And that's the point, though, isn't it, Jeff? I mean, won't these grey areas actually end up costing millions in litigation? Is this what a more business-friendly Labour Department meant? More business for lawyers?
That's exactly what will happen. There'll be more business for lawyers and employment advocates. There'll be a lot more work for the courts and the Employment Authority.
Can they handle that? Because currently they're absolutely overloaded.
Absolutely not. They've recently written letters to unions and employers around the place to say, look, please slow it down. We can barely cope with the backlog at the moment.
Really?
You add in having to understand these sorts of changes and the fight for a just outcome, which would previously have been done between the employer and the worker, will end up in court, and the unions will end up in court, and the employers will. And we'll all be paying lawyers, and we'll be waiting for months and months and months for what could be very simple issues. The real aim is to have a chilling effect. The aim is not to give really lawyers jobs, or that's possibly a happy outcome for some government backers. The aim is to have a massively chilling effect, so people go, oh, look, I don't want to go there, it's too scary. The alternative might be we see some industrial action actually get ramped up a lot sooner.
Right.
I mean, why would you do a go slow and lose your pay? May as well go out on strike. So that could be the alternate. The other outcome of this is just seeing a lot more people taking strike action sooner.
Final question to both of you. Will the government water these new industrial laws down, or are they just going to push ahead with it?
Well, you know, the Minister will say that'll be up to the Select Committee. My experience of the Minister and this government and any industrial law changes is they don't water things down. They stick to their agenda. I think that it's going to be a fight in the Parliament, but it needs to be a fight outside the Parliament. And the key to it will be is having New Zealanders understand this is going to affect their wages.
Is this government anti-work?
I think profoundly so. Everything we've seen for the past nearly 4 years has shown that depth of almost hatred for ordinary New Zealand workers. It's ramped up since the last election. It seems to have gotten even nastier. If you look back though and think, what is this about bolstering the power of poor employers and the power of capital and reducing the ability of ordinary workers. There's nothing in this that will see wages grow. It will do nothing to redress our workers going to Australia.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, 555 public sector jobs gone last year and another 400 to go this year. Why does the government need even more bargaining power from the new State Sector Act? Jeff, a 2007 State Services Commission survey of 6,500 New Zealanders found us to have one of the highest levels of public satisfaction towards the public service in the world. Why are the government fixing something that ain't broken?
Well, you're right. We have got a very well-respected public sector here in New Zealand. It ain't broken. It's ideological. There seems to be this small government mindset that they've got to keep driving down the terms and conditions and driving down the numbers of people. Now, the proposed legislation for the State Sector Act change, much of which we actually support. It will see chief executives be looking at more outcomes across agencies rather than worrying so much about their own tiny patch. So there are some good things for New Zealanders in this, but they are sadly vastly outweighed by features such as the New Zealand government being able to tell chief executives how they bargain. So can they give pay rises, yes or no? It means that when we're at the bargaining table with a chief executive, are we talking to that CE or are we talking to the government? Well, it'll be the government. We're going to see further use of outsourcing, or what they've called best sourcing is the latest phrase of the day. And that requires every government organisation to continually review its operations and to think, can this be done better? Now, as you know, we have a private prison here in New Zealand, just recently opened. The PSA's opposed that strongly. Our concern is that we're going to see more of that outsourcing happen, and also we're going to see more of those statutory obligations of the state, like locking people up, that sort of thing. Child, Youth and Family at the moment can have certain statutory rights to protect children. Will that be outsourced or best sourced to some private organisation? So underlying this ideology is, how can they unlock billions of dollars worth of state sector business and give that to their mates in the private sector? That's the pragmatic reality going on.
Can that small government belief work in a recession when we're all Keynesians now? Surely the free market dogma has been proved to be an absolute failure after the 2007 crash.
Well, yes. Well, we look at France, where their president has come in saying, look, we've got to spend to make money. We've got to dig our country out of this recession. We look at Britain, which has had even worse recessionary approaches than New Zealand. It's cut back on the size of the state, laid off even more public service workers, and they're spiralling out of control. We do need to spend. We do need to have the public sector put some more money in. It's classic priming the pump territory to say, well, we've got to cut back and chip away and get rid of good jobs, particularly now good jobs in the regions like Invercargill, the West Coast, the far north. These jobs are not being replaced, and our fear is the legislation they're proposing to change is going to make that worse.
Darien, what message does this send to the private sector if this is how the government wants to negotiate with unions by watering down good faith bargaining?
Well, I think it's a really interesting piece of legislation in that particular part, because for the first time, you know, it's going to be legally binding on chief executives, setting the pay parameters, workforce policies, they're calling it. I think the message is that, look, the message to private sector unions is the government's going to try and match your behaviour, you know, because we all know there's a difference in the public sector and the private sector in terms of unionisation. And the public sector, because of its size, does actually set labour market standards. They want to run those down. Well, we've seen it in the US recently, in Wisconsin and Ohio, where public sector workers' collective bargaining have come under attack. And unionisation in New Zealand is much more prevalent in the public sector than the private sector. So I think this is a direct attack on collective bargaining and wages and terms and conditions in the public sector, sending a message to the private sector that we're catching up with you, rather than the public sector leading the way.
So it's actually lowering the leaders who are driving the current momentum to make workers' rights stronger. It's by lowering those leaders and say, well, that's a new threshold. And it brings everyone down.
Yes, I think so.
Jeff, the bill allows the government to bypass the collective bargaining process and dictate conditions through an order of council, which effectively forces departments to implement policy by way of government directive. Should any employer, including the government, be able to have this type of leverage at the negotiating table? Why bother negotiating if it's just do as we tell you?
Well, that's our thinking. As I said before, we'll be bargaining, but we're not bargaining with the real power that's there, and the real power will be sitting in government, issuing its directions and orders. So that's a major pressure and a risk for us that sort of thing's going to happen.
Yeah.
So that's the danger which we do need to oppose in this proposed legislation, that there is I think, a huge irony here. And this is the government that says, look, we don't get involved in bargaining. If there's a dispute, don't talk to us. Don't talk to the Minister of Labour. Don't talk to the Prime Minister. It's hands off. But behind the scenes, they're going to be very much hands on. So at the very same time, they're trying to show somehow it's the problem is over there, and ministerial accountability doesn't exist. In reality, through orders in council, they'll be determining the outcomes of bargaining.
Darien, this Act will encourage more outside consultants. At what point do we threaten the viability of the state to resource its own intellectual grunt to critique and craft policy? And should the public be concerned about losing that capability? Yes,
I think they should be, and I think we saw it during the last national government of the 1990s, where there was so much downsizing of the state, and in fact they couldn't even run an election. Remember, in 1999 there weren't the resources to do it. Consultants were rife throughout the sector, and Labor had to rebuild it, and so it is a threat to the public. We have to have an independent public sector. And what this legislation is about actually taking away that independence and having chief executives and others more directly accountable to ministers, and ministers having a lot more say over what happens, including the terms and conditions of workers in the public sector.
Should we be concerned about the actual consultancy itself? I mean, a public service, as you said, is supposed to provide information without bias or influence. If you have consultants who are suggesting a course of action, and they also work for the person that they're suggesting gets the money or the contract tendering, doesn't that concern us that maybe the policy isn't really being crafted for the benefit of New Zealanders, but for the benefit of another company wanting to get that money?
I think that's right, and I think Jeff's right. I mean, this is about letting the private sector get their hands on public money and public influence. And there's a separation there doesn't happen often with consultants. And I mean, part of our job in opposition is to dig these things out and to expose them. And I think we're seeing more and more of this kind of cronyism. This kind of giving jobs for the boys, jobs for the mates. And you're seeing that in consultancies in the public sector. That's very, very dangerous.
Final question to both of you. Under this, equal employment opportunities become less of a responsibility. If the government doesn't champion equal employment opportunities, who's going to?
Well, probably no one. And this is one of the shames. For years, the New Zealand government, through its public sector employment practices, has been, in many ways, an exemplar. And equal employment opportunities and hiring physically disabled people, for example.
Absolutely.
And looking at pay and employment equity and finding ways in which groups of people who are disadvantaged can be helped into the workplace. All gone. Now it's becoming like a race to the bottom. And the sad thing is that is affecting younger workers in particular. In the public service, there's been so few younger workers have been hired in recent years. People my age and above find it easier to get jobs in there. But the old career path of going in as a cadet or a younger worker, learning the trade, learning how to do it well, has all gone. And that's a shame to lose that.
If government doesn't lead on these issues, who's going to lead on those issues?
Well, that's right. And what we end up is with a Minister of Women's Affairs, the only concern she seems to have is about having women on private sector boards. So when we talk about paid parental leave, she stands up and opposes it. I mean, this is a government doesn't believe in leading on issues like pay and employment equity, making it easier for women to be in the workforce, doing something about making sure people have equal opportunities. I mean, they're fundamental rights, the rights to equality in the workplace, but this government doesn't believe it. They think they're kind of nice to haves.
Is that a lack of political courage? I mean, sometimes you've got to step up and say people are equal, we're going to pay them more, even if that does cost. The signal that sends the rest of society is actually pretty important, isn't it?
Yes, but it's ideology. It's ideology. They believe that that there is a level playing field. The market will decide everything. Whether or not you're a woman or you've got disabilities and so on. The market is the master, and so it is about ideology. And they think these other things are sort of nice to have. have fringe issues.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. The Local Government Act Amendment Bill is aimed at muzzling local government into less spending and cheaper labour costs. Darien, will this bill strangle local democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a political attack on local government. There's no doubt about it. It was engineered by Nick Smith.
Yes.
And I could see it coming in the House when he was asking himself patsy questions about costs of local government, you know, costs of staff, activities and so on. He did it in ACC. You know, you remember he engineered a crisis, and that was the justification for making major change. Look where that's ended up. That's ended up in a real mess, but it's quite deliberate. And of course, the figures that have come out from local government, and I think others, Treasury and others, have shown that his figures are wrong.
Yes.
But it is a deliberate attack on local government. This is the next frontier of the government trying to occupy people's rights.
Because people, the total number of people who are now employed by local government has dropped dramatically since '98. So where is the justification that they're overspending?
Well, there is no justification. The figures don't stack up. These are Nick Smith's own figures. David Carter is now the local government minister. I think probably less enthusiastic about it, you know, but it's going through. There's submissions being heard now, but there is no justification for that. Nick Smith was trying to suggest that wages have got out of control in local government as well.
Oh, is that what the line was?
That was the line too. And then the other thing is that local governments were wasting money on a whole lot of nice-to-have things.
That's right.
And he was trying to redefine what the purpose of local government is, which is, you know, pretty serious too.
Jeff, government have spun a line that local government are out of control, spending great pay of money on frivolous things like local and regional infrastructure that central government aren't funding. If local government can't borrow, can the private sector pick up the slack, and will that strengthen or weaken workers' rights?
Well, they're probably hoping the private sector will pick up the slack, although they'll pick up the nice little juicy parts of the snack and leave the more difficult things to local government or to social work outfits. I think that the problem here, as Darien has said, is one of loss of local accountability and pure democracy. I mean, we look at what happened when they sacked the regional council in Canterbury.
That's right, that's right.
And the people who live down there still haven't got the opportunity to vote for their own local reps.
That's right.
Now that situation is at risk across the entire country. And again, it's insidious, this one, because it looks based on, well, goodness me, we've got to save money. It's all an outrage. You know, there's costs of delivery of services has gone up and so forth. A couple of things here. Well, one is, well, yes, councils do spend money. They buy things like bitumen for the roads. That's expensive. Secondly, well, yes, the GDP or the proportion of GDP has increased. Well, when the rest of the economy is going down the toilet, at least local government is holding their end up and it's keeping GDP ticking along. So they've taken what could be some good outcomes and have twisted it. And the end result will be, sadly, an attack and another chilling effect on the local government situation in New Zealand.
Question both of you, how low should we set the threshold for government interference when it comes to local government? Where's that point?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think we're reaching the bottom of the threshold, actually, where they're removing local democracy and the choice of people to vote on how they govern. So we could have more forced amalgamations. As Jeff said, we had Environment Canterbury. We also had the issue of Auckland. Now we've kind of moved on from that, but remember, you know, they completely ignored the commission, the Social Commission on Auckland, and they also, people were saying they wanted to have a vote on it. It didn't happen. So we're going to see forced amalgamations. People are not going to have a choice on how they govern locally.
Wasn't the super city supposed to strengthen the voice of Auckland? This is actually going to weaken it.
Well, that was a theory, and you know, 2,000 jobs lost later. I guess it's up to the locals to think, has our voice been weakened or not? The new legislation does provide for making it so much easier to amalgamate, and I guess our fear is we're going to see councils being set up to fail with very low thresholds. We're going to see increased politicisation. So, you know, we like the Ellerslie Flower Show because that's nice and middle class. So we'll let that sit. But we don't like the V8 races in Hamilton because that's a wee bit bogey and a bit more working class. So let's sort out the Hamilton Council. And the best way to sort it is, sorry, mate, guys, you're spending too much, your debt's too high, better amalgamate. So I think the bar is going to be set pretty low for interference, but the interference will be driven by the issues of the day and what's hitting the front page of the newspapers.
A question to both of you. Do you think it's acceptable central government pressuring local government to sell their assets? Because those are assets their ratepayers have paid for.
No, absolutely not. And in fact, I think there needs to be more accountability around those assets. Like my ports bill, for example, where you can't get any answers under the Official Information Act. So there needs to be more accountability and transparency. But it's not up to the central government to be deciding those things.
Absolutely.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. I think that local government is not flawless. There's a lot of work that can be done.
Of course.
We've got 6,000 members in local government, and we're preparing a marvellous submission, and we'll go to the Sept committee and we'll be arguing for some good changes, but not for these changes. We think that they are disruptive and destructive, and they will result in ordinary New Zealanders, not just the workers, but also ordinary local people having even less say in what happens in their local community.
Final question on this then for both of you. How can locally elected representatives represent their voters if it's central government that's calling the shots? What's the point?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question, and I think it's going to get harder and harder. Or if this goes through, people are going to get less and less interested in apps, you know, because they go there to represent local people. So we get back to people doing it because they have other motives. Again, you know, the private sector getting their hands on ratepayers' money. I think it will be very damaging if it goes through as it is.
This is just going to create more apathy, isn't it?
Well, it's sadly, the apathy, I think, will be from local people who would stand for local council and want to make a difference, who represent social and cultural and economic and environmental issues. I think what we'll see is that two things. One is, well, three things. There'll be a chilling effect, and those people won't want to stand. Secondly, we'll see the power of the mayor to become more of a chief executive get enhanced. So we've got that corporatist model. And thirdly, I can't see anything but, well, if you're going to stand for local council, you may get those sorts who love the economic side of things. What's in it for me and my mates? So we think that the focus on the economy is going to attract a certain sort of person.
Thank you, panel. Let's wrap the show with a final word. Darien, your final word this week is?
Okay, I wanted to talk about members' bills. We've had two big members' bills this week, and it was interesting for me because the marriage equality was a big, you know, it was a big deal. But if you're in the House, you would have noticed there was a lot of people in the gallery. There were a lot of people in the gallery, very supportive, very dignified speeches on both sides of the House. Then we had the minimum wage bill. $15 minimum wage bill that came up straight afterwards. The gallery cleared out, so did most of the Parliament, and the Parliament reverted back to being oppositional. So that's left me with a question about how do we get that kind of mobilisation and interest around issues like the $15 minimum wage. Clearly, marriage equality captured the imagination of the population across the board. I was in Parliament talking about the cleaners who work in Parliament who are on minimum wage, who can't feed their families, and in some ways it was quite distressing to see the lack of interest in that. And so that's the question I've been left with. I've got a couple of members' bills actually on local government, on libraries, but how do we get more engagement around the issues that affect people? We've been talking a lot about poverty and inequality this week. $15 minimum wage, living wage, whatever would make a huge difference. I wish we could have seen a huge protest outside for that, and the gallery absolutely packed supporting it.
Great point, great point. Final word this week, Jeff.
Well, my question is, why do we hate young people? Why is our government changing so many laws and affecting particularly the rights of younger workers to start and have a good job? We're seeing the re-emergence of a youth rate appearing. We've got a very poor minimum wage at the moment, but that's not low enough. We are seeing increasing numbers of younger people head over to Australia. We are seeing enormously high unemployment for younger workers. So what sort of message are we telling the younger people of this country? Now, a shameless plug here for the PSA coming up very soon. I'll get there. I do think there are some ways ahead, though. I see a lot of young people in my work, a lot of younger workers. There is the desire for change. Their eyes are open. This idea of this lacklustre Generation Y is rubbish. It doesn't exist. We're seeing young workers who want to join unions or get mobilised or go to Greenpeace or whatever in order to make the world better. And the PSA has a youth network, PSA Youth, and join us on Facebook or Twitter. That's our framework for us to better represent the thousands of younger workers in the PSA. And all I can say to younger people is get involved, join the union, join Greenpeace, join whatever, and don't let them do you down.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Darien. That's it for the show. Check out our Facebook site for ongoing union campaigns and actions, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thanks for watching Aotearoa. Join us again at 8 PM next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.